be interesting, just like this one here today. Our next actual event is going to be for spring break. We have our spring break activities that will be going on. There's kind of 2 weeks there because the Barton County schools, their spring breaks are not coinciding this year. So we have activities the week of March 9th and then also the week of March 16th. And so we have our drop-in science activities in the afternoons each day, some different activity each day. And you can check our Facebook page or the website for what activities are going on. But so basically from the 9th through the 20th, activities in the afternoons each day that you can, if you have kiddos that want to come out and do those activities, bring them on out. We also, our KWEC Wild Club, which is for kids, school-aged kids and their families. We have our monthly activities for them, and the next one of them will be on March 9th and the 16th, that Monday morning. And the kids will be kind of constructing and decorating birdhouse gourds to make birdhouses. And so those activities are also free. We do need you to register for those, though. And so on that one. We have our Turtle Tots preschool program on March 13th as well. And so if you know any preschoolers ages 3 to 5, we have activities at 10 o'clock on the 13th for them. You can register your kids for those as well. And we're also taking reservations for our Prairie Chicken Lek tours this spring. They will start up here in March. March 18th is our first one, and they kind of extend through the month of April, taking people out to watch prairie chickens on the lek this spring. So you can check those out as well. But we're very glad to have you guys here today. I think you're in for a great program. We have Dr. Mandel here to give a program today. Just a little bit about Dr. Mandel. We kind of interesting. It was last spring. He was here for a field conference with the Kansas Geological Survey. Who met here, and it was a great group to have. And that evening, we took a little field trip up to the overlook up on Highway 4, and it was one of the most gorgeous evenings ever, I think, that evening. Everyone was kind of milling around up there, and all of a sudden, Dr. Mandel starts giving kind of an impromptu presentation. And I was just blown away by the topic, talking about basically a lot of what he's going to be talking about today. And I hurriedly afterwards, after we got back on the bus, I ran up there and I said, "So, you're coming here to give a program for us, aren't you?" And he said, "Well, I can probably do that." So we were glad to get him here this spring to give a program, which I think will be great. So just a little bit about Dr. Mandel. He's the director of the Kansas Geological Survey, and where he also serves as a state geologist, senior scientist and executive director of the Odyssey Geoarchaeology Research Program. In addition, he is a university distinguished professor of anthropology at the University of Kansas. He has been an editor of an international journal and has been well published in many books and journals. He has spent over 40 years working with archaeologists on projects throughout the United States and the Eastern Mediterranean, focusing on the effects of geologic processes on the archaeological record. So during the past 20 years, much of his interest has involved the use of geoscientific methods to search for the earliest evidence of humans in the Central Great Plains and the Midwest. He's received many awards and recognitions throughout his professional career, and we're very happy to have him here with us today to present on this topic, which is searching for the first humans in the Americas, a geoarchaeological and paleoecological perspective. And so we'd like to welcome Rolfe here, and glad to have him. So thank you.
Thank you, Cruz. And thanks for having me here. Though you did corner me that bus, as I remember. But no, I'm glad to be here. Glad to see such a large group of people here on such a pretty day. And some kids, that's good. I asked my wife if she wanted to come hear me talk, and her response was, "Honey, I've heard you talk enough. You go." So we've been married almost 40 years, so I couldn't argue with her about that. But anyway, I'm going to talk a lot about geoarchaeology and archaeology, and maybe a little less in paleoecology, because I'm trying to squeeze all that in and less than 5 hours might be difficult. I won't keep it that long, I promise. But most of my training really is in the geosciences. I've worked with archaeologists, as Curtis mentioned, for over 40 years now. So you might say I know enough to be dangerous when it comes to archaeology. But I really spend most of my time putting the archaeological record into a geologic context. And also, I've spent a lot of time studying how geologic processes alter that record, and also how it oftentimes buries that record, which you're going to see in my presentation. So, I'm director of the Odyssey Research Program, which is a private endowment at the University of Kansas that provides support to actually go out and look for the earliest evidence of people. My region, as you'll see, is pretty much the mid-continent of North America, and so I'm going to talk about some of those projects, particularly ones that are relatively close to here. I'll drift out a little bit beyond the Central Plains to show you a couple. So I'm going to keep it informal. If you have questions as I go through this, don't hesitate to interrupt me. My students do that all the time. So throw something at me or whatever if you have a question. Certainly I'll be glad to.
Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. I'll certainly be glad to address any questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, as soon as you get settled in, I'm going to dim the lights here. And hopefully I'll be able to multitask with buttons here and see how this works too. So what I thought I'd do is to provide a backdrop for the archaeology, talk a little bit about the paleoecology of this particular region. And so, if you could put yourself into a time machine and go back to about 30,000 to 24,000 years ago, this is what the uplands around the Cheyenne Bottoms would look like. It would have been grasses, but you also would have had quite a bit of sage amongst the grasses. It was a relatively dry and a fairly cool environment. Now you may ask, how do I know this? One of my colleagues, who did his PhD about the same time I did, Glenn Fredlin, went out into the bottoms and took a core that went down about almost 20 meters, so 60 feet or so, and analyzed the pollen that was preserved in that core. Now, when most people, you start talking about pollen, you're thinking about ragweed that makes you miserable. Well, there are pollenologists who study the pollen assemblage, and the place it's best preserved typically are in old lakes or any type of poorly drained setting where the water keeps the oxygen away from the pollen. Because if you get oxygen mixed in there, it oxidizes the pollen goes away. But if it stays saturated, it's deoxidized. And we've got pollen records going back tens of thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands of years in some places. So that pollen record could tell you something about the vegetation that's growing in the general region, okay? And so what I'm telling you is, based on Glenn's pollen record, which goes back to about 30,000 years ago, this is what the landscape would have looked like around here. So not a whole lot different, but a little different. If you drop down into the bottoms, it actually looked pretty much like it does today. It was a shallow pond, very shallow water. You wouldn't have ditches along the edge of it. That's, of course, human constructed. But that's pretty much what it looked like during 30,000, 24,000 years ago. Now this time right here, 24,000 years ago, is pretty much approaching what we call the last glacial maximum. During our last part of the Ice Age, we call it Wisconsin Ice Age. The furthest south ice got to this area would have been Des Moines, Iowa. There was a lobe of ice that literally would have ended right about the south side of town in Des Moines. That's as close as ice, in fact, has ever gotten to Kansas. A lot of people think, that would have been a horrible time to be here. But there was no ice. Not only that, believe it or not, the climate would have been a lot better than it is today. You would not have had extremes. The winters would not have been as extreme, and the summers were not extreme. The tilt of the Earth's axis was not as great as it is today. It's that tilt that creates seasonality. And the reason we know that is we know what type of animals lived here at that time. It would have looked a lot different than it does today, right? So you would have had woolly mammoth. They'd have probably wandered down to the bottoms here. You'd have these steppe bison, which are now extinct, much bigger versions, about a third to half the size bigger than the modern bison. And this always surprises people. You'd have the American camel. Okay, it's a one hump camel, kind of a cute little thing. What's interesting is, so this guy was living with this guy. And so this guy likes it relatively cool, this guy likes it relatively warm. And for them to coexist, it's got to be what we call an equitable climate. Not too cold for this guy and not too warm for that guy. And we also look at some of the smaller mammals, we call them microfauna, like voles. And they're really good measures of climate. And they also tell us it was a very equitable climate. So if you were living here back then, you'd had a great food source, no question about that. However, you'd had some real nasty predators. You would not have been at the top of the food chain, okay? You had these dire wolves, which were almost twice the size of a modern wolf. You'd had the giant short-faced bear, which if it stood up in this room, its head would just about hit the ceiling up here. You can see a guy there for scale. Gives you an idea, it's a pretty big bear, and it was definitely a carnivore. Of course, you had the saber-toothed cat. So those were the primary predators down here. So that could have been a problem for you. But other than that, it would have been a pretty nice place to live. Climatically, it would have been, like I said, it would have been much more comfortable. You know, we endure these hot, humid summers, these cold winters, you know, it would not have been like that. Pretty nice. However, if we go back to about 24,000 to about 16,000, and Glenn Fredlin would argue maybe even close to 11,000 on this, based on the record from the Cheyenne Bottoms, that he sees there's a big gap in deposition of the Cheyenne Bottoms, and that it was basically a big mud flat for this entire period of record, and maybe pushing as early as 11,000 years ago. So it became pretty much a cold, very dry climate, okay? But then there was a shift. 16,000, 12,000 years ago, it goes back. This is probably what the bottoms look like. They're pretty wet. You had mammoth. If you look in the background, there's some camels wandering around. There's a sloth, a tree sloth here, some more mammoth. It would have been a pretty rich environment. Notice the trees, though. You got conifers. It's primarily spruce, ponderosa pine, and actually quite a bit of aspen. You know, you don't think about aspen out here today, right? But that's what it looked like. It was pretty much a open spruce, pine, aspen parkland. Pretty rich environment. And undoubtedly, something like that would have attracted people. They would have been very rich, and and the mammoth would be a primary food source. You look at the spear points, as I'll show you in a second. The spears they used would have dispatched an animal this big, pretty easily. Okay, so it looked a lot different. So from about 12,000 years ago to just 150 years ago, before this area was settled and altered the uplands, of course, with agriculture, this is what it's looked like. It's pretty much the mixed, tall, short-grass prairie. That's what's basically what I'm telling you is what you have out there today was around beginning about 12,000 years ago. So it's been in place for a long time. It's changed a little bit during the driest part of the Holocene, which is about the last 10,000 years, the Holocene is. About 7,000 to 6,000, it got pretty dry, and so the tall grasses probably would have given way to the short grasses more so. But still, it would have been a mixed prairie. And this, of course, is a very, very favorable environment for bison, the modern bison. And you know, they would have come down to the Cheyenne Bottoms to go after water, right? And of course, with them doing that, there would have been people. People would have been attracted not only to the water, but also to the animals that went down there. This shows hunters springing up from the grass to hurl darts. I'm going to show you what these darts look like from adult animals and bison gaze the pond. And these were mainly what we call Folsom people. They're a little bit later than the Clovis, not by much, but they were bison hunters, and they would have been really happy here because there would have been a lot of bison they'd been going after. So this begs the question. This is what I'm going to try to address. You know, when did people actually arrive in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere? You know, were there people here before Clovis? I'm going to talk about Clovis in just a minute. But In other words, were people here before around 13,500 years ago? And if we just go back maybe even 25 years, most people would have said no. Over the last 25 years in particular, we've seen that more and more evidence has come forward that suggests people were here before Clovis. And then it also begs the question, when were people here, like in the Cheyenne Bottoms area, basically the Central Great Plains of North America, which is what I've spent a good chunk of my career trying to figure out, okay? And so there's a lot of debate, and it's a really hot topic about the arrival of people into the New World. And so this article came out a couple of years ago in the journal Nature, which is a pretty prestigious journal. And it claims that there's evidence of people here 130,000 years ago at a site, it's a mastodon site, literally in the town of San Diego. They discovered when they were putting a highway in, and they dug up, exposed this mastodon. This was actually back in the 70s. And the lead author, Steve Holland, actually was one of my PhD students, and the geologist on the team is shown on here is Jared Beaton. He was actually my first PhD student. I always told them to think outside the box, right? Well, I gotta tell you, this is way outside the box. Pushing it because people have a hard time going back 1,000 or 2,000 years before Clovis. And we're talking Paleolithic, or not only Paleolithic, well, actually we're talking about something pre-Paleolithic, something Neanderthal or Neanderthal-like in the Americas. Now I gotta tell you, this created a lot of controversy when this came out. Most American archaeologists dismissed it, saying it's impossible. And so I had a call from the New York Times asking me to comment on this. And I said, well, first I got to tell you, the two of the authors, including the lead author, were my students. Do you still want to hear what I had to say? They said, yeah. He said, yeah. So what do you think? I said, well, first of all, I said, I never use the word impossible. I just don't use it. I always tell my students never use that term because, for example, continental drift. Everybody knows about continental drift here, I'm sure. Continental drift was considered impossible even in the 1960s and early 1970s by some pretty prestigious geologists. We now know that it's real, so they all had to eat crow. You know, so don't use that word impossible. I said to be fair, it's not particularly likely. I said that I need some more evidence. In particular, they found this mastodon and they found it in fine-grained flood deposits. Water would come up out of a river and get deposited onto a floodplain. And they found some pretty big rocks that looked like anvil stones and hammer stones right next to it. I said, you got to explain to me how those rocks got there, because those didn't float in. So if someone could give me a good explanation as to why they're there that's other than human, or human that maybe sometime later somehow got those incorporated in, then I might, I'll give you a better answer as to whether I think it's, real or not. But the jury's still out. It's interesting. A lot of Europeans, Australians, and people in the South Pacific, they're actually more on board with this. The geneticists hate it because there's no evidence. We know about rates of mutation in DNA that people were here 130,000 years ago, but it could be that this was a founding population that arrived in San Diego and didn't survive. Therefore, their DNA did not get incorporated into the Native American population today. So there's all sorts of ways to challenge it, but the American community, I will tell you, none of them believe it. So it's a stretch. One of my other colleagues, this paper came out just about 6 months ago. It's published in Science, which also is a very prestigious journal, and it pushes it back to 16,000 years ago. And so again, if we talked about Clovis goes back to about 13,500. So this is pushing it back several thousands of years. And this is pretty solid. Very few people have challenged it. A few have. Stuart Fidel, who I'm going to talk about in a second, has challenged it. But I think it's solid. So I have no issue with this. I think this is really strong evidence that people were in Idaho 16,000 years ago. Okay? So to kind of give you a perspective on the archaeological record in North America, this is the Folsom site, this old grainy photograph. 1927 is when the Folsom site was discovered in Folsom, New Mexico. And If you go to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, they pedestaled this out of the site. These are the bones of extinct bison. These are rib bones. If you look right there, there's a very distinct Folsom point in contact with the bones. It can't get any better than that in terms of association. And so this has been argued as the first evidence in 1927 of people living in the Ice Age with extinct animals. You know, there's a co-occurrence of extinct animals and people in North America. So that's why the Folsom site is so famous. However, by the way, here's what a Folsom point looks like. It's got this very distinct flute, this groove right here. Here's the dates on Folsom. So this is in calendar years, 12/6 to 12/1. This is in radiocarbon years. So these ages are corrected to calendar years. Basically, you have to add about 2,000 years to a radiocarbon date in this period because of the radiocarbon plateau, which I'm not going to get into unless you want a long discussion on physics. I'll spare you, but those are the dates on Folsom. But here's an interesting side story. Samuel Williston, he served as a professor of geology and anatomy. That's an interesting combination, right? And as the first dean of the School of Medicine, 1890 to 1902. Very much a Renaissance man, a really smart guy. Well, he sent two of his colleagues out to the 12-Mile Creek site in Logan County. So this would be north and west of here. Now, it's actually right next to the new state park, the Little Jerusalem. You can almost see the site from Little Jerusalem. 1895, 30 years before the discovery of Folsom. So Williston's assistants, Mark and Overton, found a small fluted point in direct association with a complete bison skeleton. They found, basically at the bottom of this cliff, they found 12 bison that were eroding out. And they knew, based on the geology, they were in Pleistocene deposits. And they found one point in direct association with those bison. And there's what the bison look like. There's this skeleton. If you go to the Museum of Natural History at KU, you'll see it on display. It's been dated to around, in radiocarbon years, dates to about 10,800 years ago, so add 2,000 to that. And so they've got 12 of them there at the museum. And here's the point. This is a sketch. There's also a photo, but the photo is extremely grainy. This is a little better illustration. This looks very Folsom-like. It's got a little bit of a flute there. The shape, the size, looks very Folsom. And like I said, this was discovered 30 years before the Folsom site. So you might ask yourself, so why is the Folsom site so famous for being the first association of people with extinct bison? Well, story has it that Williston went to a tea party at the Chancellor's house to show off this projector point that was passed around and disappeared. And he was too embarrassed to ask anybody for the point back. So the point was lost. Okay, so that's like the smoking gun was lost, right? Because at that point, all he had was 12 dead bison and no point, and a sketch and a real bad photograph. Okay, so this kind of sums it up. He recognized the significance of the find. They eventually recovered 12 bison beneath 5.5 meters of sediment, determined that they were in the Equus bed. Some of you may have heard the term Equus beds. The Great Bend, the alluvial aquifer is the Equus beds there. It's a Pleistocene deposit, dating the late Pleistocene. Despite its significance, the site was largely ignored by the anthropological community. Some scholars question the antiquity of the bison, despite the fact that they were in a geologic unit that contained mammoth, horse, camel, other places in fauna. Waldo Wadle, some of you may recognize his name. He wrote a book on the archaeology of Kansas. He was the curator of archaeology at the Smithsonian, and great guy. Really knew a lot about Kansas archaeology. But I just love this statement. He said, "Here as elsewhere in America at the time, I suppose there would have been no question about the Pleistocene dating of the site had there not been evidence of human association." So basically what he's saying is because there was a human association, these animals are not Pleistocene. They're later. So basically the community, the scientific community threw it out because they just absolutely were not convinced that it was Pleistocene. And this sort of underscores the whole idea about it's hard to change thinking, once it's ingrained. And just similar to what I'm saying about pre-Clovis. It's taken a lot to convince people that were here before Clovis time. Paradigms are hard to dismiss. And that's basically what Waldo Wedel was saying. You said it in a different fashion. It's because it's a paradigm. It's hard to get people to think outside that paradigm. Okay?
With the bathwater.
What's that? Throwing the baby out with the bathwater? That's essentially what they did. So it's quite, I actually went back to the 12 Mile Creek site to try to see if they'd left anything that we could then study and prove that it was, in fact, an archaeological site. And unfortunately, 12 Mile Creek site, since that time, remember this is the late 1800s, has migrated all the way up against the bank there and removed everything. We found like a couple of little fragments of bison, and that was it. So it's gone. Basically, the site's gone. So it'll always be a controversy as to whether it's truly archaeological. Well, with the point, it is. But anyway, we'll leave it at that. So Clovis, this is the type locality for Clovis. This is the Clovis gravel pit, also in New Mexico, like Folsom. This is where the find was originally discovered in this gravel pit, the South Bank. And I'm looking across to the South Bank where the find was made. And so if you look close here, you can see a projectile point sticking into the sand, and the tip of it is just a little bit underneath that vertebrae of a mammoth. So again, like the Folsom find, there's direct association between, in this case, a vertebrae of a mammoth and a spear point. And the spear points are beautiful. That's a classic Clovis spear point, and you can see the real diagnostic flute there. There's another flute right there where there's basically a flute scar. And so here we're going back in calendar years 13,500 to about 11, and this is in radiocarbon years. So again, we're adding about 2,000 years to the radiocarbon age. They're very diagnostic. When you see a Clovis point, and they're big. A lot of them are big. They can be like that big. Again, if you want to kill a mammoth, you need a big spear point, right? Or if you run into a short-faced bear, you want to have it. So, how did people get here? And there are two main hypotheses. One is they came down the ice, they went around the ice along the Pacific coast, worked their way south. There was what we call the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet that people could have come down, probably did, and spread out and continued south, or both. They could have gone both ways, along the coast and through the ice-free corridor, and eventually made their way down to Monte Verde in the southern part of Chile, which is an important point. Okay, so there are radiocarbon dates around 12,500 years ago. So 14,500 calendar years ago. There are some dates as old as 33,000, but I'm not convinced that they're associated with archaeological material, but these dates are good. So what I say here is acceptance of the Monte Verde site dating to at least 1205 or 1404 in calendar years opens pre-Clovis possibilities for North America. So just think about this. I'll back up for a second. This is a pretty long walk from here to there. And you got to know where you're going. You have to get through a pretty narrow passage here. If people were down here, I think it's solid, 14,400 years ago, you would think they had to be here well before that, right? Wouldn't that be logical? They didn't run, and they probably didn't take a boat. So I think it's safe to say they were here before that, okay? So Monte Verde is really important to the story here that I'm telling you about what's going on in this part of the world. So as I mentioned, I'm director of the Odyssey program. It was a private endowment. The mission of it is to use geoscientific methods, basically geology, to search for the material remains of the first people who occupied the Central Plains of the Midwest. Strong emphasis on finding pre-Clovis. There was something older than 13,500 years ago. So Joe was a geologist. He was convinced that geology could play a major role in this search, and I agree with him. He was convinced I was the guy for the job because he knew that's the way I did things. So the endowment was in place at KU, and it supports lots of students, supports lots of research. There's my study area. So, it's a pretty big chunk of territory that I'm looking at. So I've got to come at this in a systematic fashion. And I also work outside this area to a certain extent, as I'll show you in a minute. So in 2013, I was at this conference. It was called the Odyssey Conference. It had nothing to do with the Odyssey program at KU. They just used that term. And so I had just given a talk similar to what I'm presenting here before about 2,000 people. It was a huge audience. And then I was followed by Stuart Fidel, who's a disbeliever in pre-Clovis. He thinks Clovis was first. And if you just look at the title of his talk, and you probably realize he doesn't buy Clovis, right? So, but I will say it's really good to have guys like him around, because you need to be challenged. You have to present data that's solid, that can stand scrutiny. As they say, extraordinary claims require what? Extraordinary data, right? Or extraordinary findings. So it's actually good to have Stuart around to argue with me all the time. So what do I think about when I think of people ask me this all the time? What comes to my mind, and it's always the word elusive, which Webster defines as hard to find or capture, hard to understand or define. Because the point I want to make is we don't even know what we're looking for. We don't know what pre-Clovis should look like. We may have walked on it and didn't even know we were walking on pre-Clovis, because we do not know what pre-Clovis looks like. So there are not diagnostic artifacts like what you see with Clovis, at least not yet. So it's elusive, but not as elusive as Bigfoot. It's one of those rare pictures of him. So, but he's pretty elusive. So here's what I think about pre-Clovis. I think it was a small population that left a sparse material record. And we're not talking about tribes here. We're talking about family units, wandering across the landscape and leaving a pretty sparse record. They probably didn't want to throw a lot of things away. Now I note here that this is a really important point. Like all prehistoric archaeological materials, they've passed through a geomorphic filter. In other words, they've been subjected to erosion. So a lot of it's probably gone. It's been eroded away. Sedimentation, a lot of it's probably been buried, so you can't see it, and or soil formation, which alters it. Soil formation alters archaeological deposits. So it's passed through this filter, which makes it even harder to find, okay? But again, it demands a geologic approach. I feel this guy's pain. I relate to this guy, because this is the proverbial needle in the haystack that I'm looking for. This is my life right here. So anyway. So I said the only way to effectively search for pre-Clovis, look for these materials, is to systematically study sedimentary deposits and soils of the appropriate age, especially in settings that would have been conducive to human occupation and other activities. In other words, take a geological approach. So in other words, like around Cheyenne Bottoms, the place to look would be around the rim of the bottoms, where people would have been living perhaps, and then dig deep and see if you can find deposits of the right age that would be pre-Clovis, and see if there's cultural material in them. Simple as that. Well, simple is not a good choice of words, but that's what you have to do to find it. Okay? So the methods here are shown. This is how I do it. I survey outcrops. I look along stream banks, quarries, road cuts. I can't tell you how many times I pulled over with my wife and son go look at a road cut, and they're sitting in the car going, let's get out of here. But I do that a lot. Coring and trenching, intensive radiocarbon dating. OSL dating it's a new technique, indicates when grains were last exposed to light. Strong focus on buried landscapes, represented by paleosols. Paleosols are old soils that date to this period. That's what I'm focusing on. I've revisited a lot of stratified sites with long histories of human occupation, especially those dating back to the terminal Pleistocene, and I looked deeper because a lot of people stopped when they got to Clovis and they didn't keep going. Okay, so if people repeatedly occupied a site, there's something there that attracted them. So got to look deeper to see if earlier people were attracted as well. I'm going to show you an example of that. The remains of mammoth or other placing fauna are found in a region I make an effort to visit the site. So when I get a call that there's been a mammoth found, or a mastodon, or a camel, I get in the car and I go check it out. So that's my life. You guys are getting a pretty good summary of it. This is what I do. Okay, this is actually kind of important for the rest of the story. These are the questions that commonly are posed when there is a claim of pre-Clovis discovery. This is the list Stuart Fidel checks off. This is a list I check off when I find something I think is pre-Clovis. So are the reported cultural deposits, are they artifacts or geofacts? A geofact is a rock that looks a lot like an artifact. And that, for example, you go in the Ozarks, you find a lot of, what we call flint or chert laying around. And if it goes through freezing and thawing, it can fracture. Or if a tractor dries over, it can fracture and look like an artifact. But when in fact it's a geofact, or in a rock shelter or cave, roof material falls, it shatters on the ground. It looks like an artifact, but it could very well be a geofact. Did younger artifacts drift downward into the cultural component that claimed to be pre-Clovis? There's a lot of what we call bioturbation, pedoturbation, soil mixing by animals, by plants, freeze-thaw, by shrinking and swelling of soils. Things fall down. So there's material that can move down and contaminate, particularly datable material moving down and contaminate something that's not as old as pre-Clovis. Did old charcoal move upward through bioturbation into a cultural component that's going to be pre-Clovis? In other words, burrowing animals bring charcoal up, old charcoal up that can contaminate a cultural deposit. Is the numerical dating accurate? There's sometimes be problems with the dating method. Did older carbon, such as coal or trial organic carbon, contaminate younger carbon? So in other words, if you're going to make a claim you got pre-Clovis, you have to check every one of these boxes, or else you may have a problem. Somebody like Stuart Fidel will say, okay, one of these is missing, so there could be a problem here. So it could be challenged. So I've spent a lot of time looking at buried Paleogen age landscapes and stream valleys. These are all my study sites prior to 2008, where I actually went around. There's almost 50 here, where I went out and looked at outcrops, oftentimes stream banks, and dated buried soils. What makes I'm looking for buried landscapes that date to Paleo-Indian and then also pre-Clovis. And so I'm going to take you to one of these localities. So here's an outline of Kansas, and I'm going to take you to the Chicaskia River. And this is what it looks like. This is the section that I studied. I actually cleaned, this is about 13 meters from top to bottom, so it's pretty high. I actually cleaned off this whole section with a hand shovel. Do not tell my wife. At the very bottom, right here, there's a buried soil. That represents, this was one, it's a terrace now. This was the floodplain about 10,000 radiocarbon years ago, so about 12,000 years ago. And so people could have been walking on this, probably were. 10,800. These are dates, I literally date the carbon in the soil. And that basically dates this soil and the landscape. So this was a stable landscape from 10,800 to 10,000 years ago. And if you were a Clovis person, this is where you'd have been, right there, which would have been right about there. Okay, so this pretty much underscores part of the problem. So you've got about 12 meters on top of this landscape, which is, unless you've got big windows like this everywhere along the river, you can't even look at the landscape that's likely to have the archaeological materials. And it's no surprise that collectors find Clovis and younger archaeological material on gravel bars downstream from this, because it's eroding and being deposited on gravel bars. Of course, once it's done that, it's out of context. It's good to know people were there then, but it has no integrity to it anymore once it's moved. So I'm going to show you another section here. This is on the Ninnasquaw, just a little bit to the east of the Chicaskia. And so there's a flight of terraces. Each one of these represents an old floodplain. And there's a dark soil, by the way, right here beneath the middle terrace, which is not this one. This one's that, where we've got buried landscapes that date to Clovis and Folsom time. But what I want to point out is in this section, which is this, see there's a buried soil right there. I have a radiocarbon date on that of 28,750 on the soil carbon. So this was the floodplain approximately 28,000 years ago. Archaeologists would have never looked at this in the past. Therefore, if there were cultural deposits, artifacts, they would never see them. This sort of setting has always been ignored because people thought it was too old. So my philosophy is we have to start looking at those if we're going to answer that question of when people arrived here, okay? So, I mean, does that make sense? This might explain why we haven't found much in Clovis, because the archaeologists didn't believe people could have been here that long ago. Therefore, they didn't look. Therefore, they didn't find, right? So we got to change our thinking. Instead of walking away from localities like this, we got to start looking and see, are they there or not, to answer that question. So I revisit stratified sites, long history. So just like I just told you, I go back to these sites where I know people were there, say, for the last 10,000 years, episodically. I say, let's look deeper. And a really good example of this is the Big Eddy site in western Missouri, actually not far from the Kansas border, on the Sac River. This is the site, so there's the Kansas border, there's the Sac River, here's the Big Bend, which is why they call it the Big Eddy site. There's a big eddy here. It has nothing to do with the mafia. Some people are suggesting with a name like that, but it's because there's a huge eddy there. And the site is right there. And Stockton Reservoir is upstream, and they let big flows out periodically to run the generators for electricity. And the river will come up 15 feet in a matter of an hour. And it's basically destroying the site. It's almost gone. And so the Corps of Engineers asked that there be a detailed study before it's gone. And so some of my colleagues at Missouri State University spent several years out there excavating, and we, the University of Kansas, participated with them, particularly in 2007. What they found at the Big Eddy site was continuous occupation from Clovis till late prehistoric time. So they had basically about a 13,000 year record of continuous occupation that would be buried, more occupation, buried for 13,000 years. So I said, let's go back and let's look deep. So that's what we did. And it was a miserable process because, so the river is just on the other side of this pile. And so whenever the Corps let these big surges of water out, it seeped through that narrow space and would fill up the site with water. So we had to then pump the water out. We had to do that every day, okay? The only thing that was happy there was this guy. But there's going to be a test question. So I want you to keep him in mind, okay? So keep that little crawdad in mind. So there I am out there in 2007, and there's a buried soil, so that's a buried landscape with late Paleoindian there, middle Paleoindian was in here, early Paleoindian was here. So this is Clovis down in this part. And I said, let's go deeper. Let's just keep looking. So the Odyssey team excavated down, and this is what we found. So these are this reddish brown sediment you see. These are flood deposits, like I was telling you at the site in San Diego. Similar, fine grained sediment that would come up and be deposited in the floodplain. But lo and behold, we have what appears to be a anvil stone, and right next to it would appear to be hammerstone. So if let's say you're hammering on bone, either make bone tools or getting marrow for food. And also amongst it was this church spall, which is here. There it is blown up. That looks like an artifact. And you got to ask how did these guys get here without people emplacing them? In other words, they look like cultural deposits. And then you look at the dates, 1407, or about 1,200 years older than Clovis, okay? So, when I just quickly look at this, I go, so here's our evidence. People were here before Clovis. Now, the radiocarbon dates, we have multiple dates that cluster at this time, were determined on small pieces of charcoal. right next to these objects. So what do you think Stuart Fidel had to say about this? Because he said you're wrong. So what do you think he said? Anybody want to take a shot at it? No, you're on. Crawdad is part of the story. What could that crawdad have done?
That brought it up.
Brought old charcoal up. Older charcoal. In other words, natural charcoal. Because, you know, there are forest fires, grass fires. There could be older charcoal that was below this. Crawdads burrow. And if you ever seen a crawdad, they create what's like these cones of material that come up as they burrow. So Stuart Fidel said, well, you've got crawdads out there. Could they have brought old charcoal that was deeper, brought it up, and it has no context with these? In other words, it wasn't there when these, he doesn't argue they're artifacts. So these are probably Clovis. And you know what? I couldn't argue with him. He's right. It could be. These could be pre-Clovis. They could be Clovis. You see the problem? Remember that checklist. Got to go through it. Got to get them all checked off. I could not argue that couldn't have happened because there were, what I needed to find was a cultural feature like a hearth right next to one of these where the charcoal is in a cultural affiliation. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm just trying to demonstrate, you know, the problem with trying to prove this in any site. Okay?
Would charcoal come about like if they had a fire going?
Well, yeah, I mean...
So if you found these artifacts next to what appeared to be a pile of charcoal from the fire?
But then that would have been stronger evidence. But the problem is we're just dealing with floating pieces of charcoal. They're not in a feature. They're not in a hearth. If we'd have found a nice basin-shaped feature full of charcoal, so that's a cultural feature, it's right next to these guys, bingo, we got it. But we didn't. They were just floating pieces of charcoal. It could be they had good context, but I can't prove it. I can't say, no, those crawdads didn't move it up. I can't say that. I don't know that. This just shows how you gotta, if you're gonna make an extraordinary claim, you have to have extraordinary evidence. I didn't have it. The coffee site, not too far from here, it's up, this is the flood pool of Tuttle Creek Reservoir. So we're on the Big Blue River. And it sits right here. Here's the Big Blue, right there. It's right in a cutbank, stream bank on the east side of the Blue River. It's a very famous site. So it's one of the few prehistoric sites of the National Register of Historic Places in Kansas. Because they found there, here's just a view of the site from the air. They found in this area right here, deeply buried back in the early 70s, cultural deposits that date between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, which is a period of time we don't have a lot of sites that have been recorded dating that time. So it became a very important site. University of Kansas excavated it for 5 years and got a lot of material out of it. But it's being destroyed by the Blue River because the Blue River is migrating this way. So the Corps engineers asked me to go out, look at it, give them an idea of what's left of the site, how much longer it's going to be around, how can they save it. It's kind of a lot to ask. But anyway, so I went out there and they allowed me to put a few backhoe trenches in, which being a National Register site, I couldn't damage it too much. But this trench, these dark sediments down in this zone, right down here, is where they found the materials dating to 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. But I said, let's continue the trench. There's another terrace up here. Let's cut into it and see if there's something older, because these are older deposits. Remember, if I'm gonna say you got to do this, I got to live by my words. Let's look at older deposits. And they said, okay, let's do it. We're here. Might as well extend the trench. And lo and behold, down in that wall, I knew these were Pleistocene deposits. So I knew the geology of this area. This is about 70 to 80 centimeters below surface. It's almost a meter below surface. There was a flake at first. I said, well, you know, that could have been bioturbated, mixed, could have come down a crack, all sorts of ways to move things down. I said, so I pulled that out. Behind it was another flake. I pulled it out. Behind it was another flake. So I kept finding material until finally, this is what I found. These are all artifacts. They're not geofacts. So I'm going, okay, we might have something really important here that no one knew about. And in fact, in 2011, after a big flood, it cleaned off this bank. You see this reddish soil. So that's the Severance Formation, which I know is Pleistocene. And each one of those flags marks an artifact. all at the same level. They don't look like they are, but they're sticking out at odd angles. But that is a living surface at about 70 centimeters below the surface. And so I'm very excited about this. There I am with Jack Hoffman, who archaeologist at the University of Kansas in the anthropology department. And so you can see these flakes sticking out, and there's a biface. There was nothing culturally diagnostic. There was nothing that said, okay, this is Clovis or this is Folsom. It was all basically what we call debitage. People were manufacturing tools, and the artifacts were falling on the ground, and none of it was diagnostic to a certain time period. And so Odyssey spent multiple years out there in the summer excavating the site, focusing on this severance formation to see if we could find, in particular, something, a cultural feature, like a hearth, that we could date. We did not find a speck of charcoal, not one speck. It's too oxidized. And what we did find, so here's that deepest component of unknown age. Above it is a middle point, and there was a Folsom preform. So there's a living surface in here as well. So there's a living surface here, that's early Paleo-Indian, and there's something older below it. And so, as I said, there was no charcoal. So I had to come up with some other ideas about how to date it. And so what we did was, it's called, I mentioned this briefly before, OSL dating. Tells you when grains of quartz or feldspar are last exposed to light. So it tells you about burial time, but it's really designed for windblown sediments. People are using it in stream deposited sediments, but it doesn't work as well. And this is where the culture material was. And if you look at this diagram, the OSL dates range from 26.8 thousand to 14,000, which there's a problem. Those numbers on the side are the errors in thousands of years. So it's 26.8 thousand plus or minus 2,800 years. And not only that, but they're all over the place. I mean, I'd like to throw these two out and keep the 14, but I can't do that. Bottom line, the dating didn't really solve the question or answer the question. Yeah, there's something down here, there's something in here that's old. Could be Clovis, could be even early Folsom, or it could be pre-Clovis. But without, again, that checklist, you have to have reliable radiocarbon or numerical ages. Don't have either one. Problem, okay? Canorado is on the Kansas-Colorado border. Here it is shot from above. There's I-70. There's the community of Canorado, Colorado. It's right here off the image. When they built I-70, they straightened the Middle Beaver Creek, and they created some cut banks along here. Here's one of them. This is Site 105. I'm standing on the uplands looking down to the first terrace. There's I-70 in the background. There's a buried soil that dives going this way, so a buried landscape. And there are buried soils in that exposure. Those are buried soils. And below those buried soils, there, by the way, is Joe Kramer, who created the Odyssey Endowment. He lived in Denver, so he came out to see this. There I am looking at bones at the bottom of the exposure that's mammoth, and that's camel. And there's a big mammoth bone sticking into the wall. So we're looking at this going, well, this could be Clovis, right? There were mammoths, remember I showed you earlier, there were mammoths, there were camel around during the late Pleistocene, or it could be pre-Clovis. Well, there I am looking at the bone that we dated. So 12,215, this is in radiocarbon years, so that's closer to 14,2. So it's about 1,000 years older than Clovis. But what I didn't find around it were any lithic artifacts, chipstone, none. However, Steve Holland, he's the one that wrote that article 130,000 years ago, my former student, and he knows a lot about bone modification. He points out the spiral fractures. That sort of fracture, if you're pulling on green bone, it breaks spirally. You won't get that with an animal stepping on it. It won't break spirally. So he says that's actually a pretty good indication of human modification. What's actually more convincing is this artifact. So, and I would say this is an artifact. This is a bone that's beveled on both sides at the end. It's beveled and it's polished. And an animal gnawing on that bone would not create a bevel, and you'd see gnaw marks. There are none. This looks like a tool. That looks very tool-like. And you show it to archaeologists, they say that's a tool until you tell them about the radiocarbon age of, that it's about 1,000 years older than Clovis. They go, let me look at it again. So, anyway, so we've got this pre-Clovis. It's in this zone right here where all those mammoth and camel were. Now, to be fair, I put a question mark. We do have a Clovis age component, a Folsom component, and a late Paleogene component. These are the artifacts that came out of this part. So it's actually the Camerata site. It's the first stratified Clovis and Folsom site in the Central Great Plains of North America. So it put Camerata on the map as being a really important site in the U.S. So in that alone, despite whether this is real or not, it's a really important site. We keep working there. So the really big haystack, I guess is the way to put it, is the Peoria loess, is the windblown loess that sits on our landscape around us here. If you go up on the high surfaces, in fact, there's a section just, well, it's where the Great Bend landfill is. We've spent a lot of time in that landfill with all the smelly trash, but looking at a big exposure of loess, including Peoria loess, which is all this yellow. You see, the thicker it gets, the redder it gets. Greater than 20 meters thick. In fact, what I'm going to show you here, but look at the distribution. It's all over the mid-continent, particularly the plains and along the Mississippi River. Problem is, you don't see a lot of exposures except like this. Okay, so this is pretty remarkable. That's me for scale. This is all windblown silt. That's dust. So you think your house is dusty. Rethink that, okay? That is all windblown. The Peoria loess, which is the lightest zone, which is what most people are farming in around here, that's what they're in, Peoria loess, dates from about 13,000 calendar years to about 25,000 years ago. So if you're looking for pre-Clovis, that's where it's going to be, but the problem is this. It's hard to see unless you find a rare one like this, okay, which are pretty rare. I'm going to show you here, to wrap up, talking about a couple of loess localities. Lucena in southwest Nebraska. This is along Harry Strunk Lake. It's a site that Steve Holland, again, worked on. This is all Peoria loess. So it was deposited 25 to 12,000 approximately years ago. There's Steve. He's looking, this is way below the surface. He sees all these pieces, fragmentary mammoth bone. And he has studied taphonomy enough to know that, in fact, he's gone out and experimented. He's hammered on bone to look at how it splays out as it fractures. And this looks very much like what you'd expect if you're hammering on bone, it splays out. And more importantly, you can even see impact points like this. He put these fragments together and could actually see the point of impact. That's not the sort of thing you get if a mammoth were just on an old dry bone. Okay, it wouldn't fracture like that. It wouldn't have an impact point. And there's flake bone like this. Again, we've shown this to archaeologists. They go, yeah, that's a bone artifact until we talk about the age. So here we are. We're 2,400, but we dropped down to 18,000. So these are the dates on the bone. So we're talking, 4,000 or 5,000 years older than Clovis. Lovewell. I don't know why we're getting that stuck in the background. What do you think? Is there a way to get rid of that? Or this could be a Mac PC thing. Yeah, let's try to fix this. Hold on. That's odd. I've never seen that happen before. But if something's going to go wrong with an image, it'll be me. There we go. So we're going to go. So we were saying we're going to go into Kansas. Lovewell. This will be in Jewell County. Lovewell Lake. There's the lake when it's really down. These flags mark bones and artifacts along the shore, like this beautiful Clovis Point. Out of place, but we know there were Clovis people there, okay? It's a beautiful point. You see the flute right there? So back in 1969, a mammoth was exposed along the lakeshore. You see the lake was really down. This was in fall. And so Tom Woody, who was the state archaeologist then, came out there and looked at it. And this is what he saw, was this disarticulated mammoth, just all jumbled. You know, that's sort of what you'd expect if you're butchering a mammoth, pulling parts apart. And he had a geologist from KDOT with him who was not what I call a quaternary geologist, not like me, who studies the quaternary the last 2.5 million years. And he looked at it and he looked across the lake and he said, I think this is too old. That's all he said. He said, it's too old. These sediments are too old. They're probably 60, 70,000 years old. He just based it on the color of the sediments. Well, he was not right. And so, but Tom Whitty said, okay, we're done here. He let a high school class come out and excavate it, and all the bones just went a gazillion different ways. So we tried to relocate some of the bone. But in 1991, Steve Hole and I came back. Fortunately, had good provenience, and we knew exactly where the animal was. And so we re-excavated. You know, this again is kind of returning to a place. And found some bone still there, not much. Found again what sort of looks like a tool, somewhat beveled, not as highly polished as that other one I showed you, but these what look like bone flakes that literally refit. And again, we showed them to archaeologists. They say those are bone artifacts until we tell them how old they are. It's that same problem. They see the date of 18,000, same date as the one up in Nebraska. So, you know, this is, you know, well before Clovis time. But again, no lithic artifacts. So it'll always be challenged as to whether it's archaeological. I said when the remains of mammoth and other Pleistocene fauna are found, I make an effort to visit the locality. The charming mammoth site in Scott County is a great example of that. So there's the site, western Kansas, the High Plains, and this is the edge of the High Plains surface. This is looking north into the Smoky Hill River Valley. And it just so happened, I was out only about 15 miles from the site with my team, looking at another mammoth site that turned into a bust. And the farmer was putting in terraces. And right here, he just clipped the top of some mammoth bones. And because it was funded by the NRCS, they had to stop, because federal money was involved. You get an archaeologist out there from the Historic Society. Archaeologists came out, looked at it, and said, well, this is old. There were no artifacts at that point. He says, but I think Rolfe's just a few miles away. His team ought to come over and look at this. So he called me, we came out, we looked at it. And there was an entire mammoth sort of spread out, disarticulated, but even more so than the one at Ludlow. But in, you know, distinct elements like the scapula, the ribs. Unfortunately, it was only buried about just barely half a meter below surface, so for about 40 centimeters. So the bones were in pretty bad shape because they've been weathering close to the surface. But nevertheless, you know, we said, okay, we're going to look at we're going to spend some time here. So we spent years every summer out at the site excavating, and lo and behold, about 50 meters off to the side, we found this. Same elevation. Again, the farmer had just clipped the top of this feature. Remember I said what you really want to find are features, right? And these are all artifacts. There's over 1,000 artifacts. And it looked like it was a napping pile where someone's making or sharpening tools and all the debitage is falling into a pile, right? And it's all exotic material. It's Smoky Hill jasper, so it's not even from the area. So it has to be archaeological. Has to be. And it is. So I said, okay, same depth. As these guys with a date of 13,470. It's the oldest radiocarbon date's 11.5. So a couple thousand years older. Here we go. Finally found it, right? All right, we're gonna back up to our feature. So, Jack Hoffman, my colleague, is looking at this. He says, well, so the circle, it's awfully sharp boundaries. And one of the artifacts in it looked like a flake that came off a flute. Wasn't sure, but what really bothered me was the statement, this looks more like a pit than a pile. So what do you think Stuart Fidel said about this? A pit rather than a pile. Anyone want to take a shot at it?
It fell down.
Well, someone dug a pit at the surface, and this is intrusive. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Later, in other words, all that rust came in, and then later people, it's fluted, so it's, or if that flute is, or that channel flake, they call them channel flakes, that channel flake is real. Pale Indian people came in later, they dug a pit, they pushed all their trash, this, into a pit. So it's intrusive, and is not in association with these guys, with these bones. So there we go. You know, again, you got to check off that list. I couldn't argue. Until we find, and we haven't, an artifact directly in association with these bones, ideally stuck in a bone, then it's conjecture. It's a maybe, pre-plebiscite, maybe. So the story here is Peoria Luss, coming back to this, has high potential, but it's a real visibility problem. This is where we should be looking, this is where we should focus, out in this part of the world, but you gotta have exposure to see it, or somebody putting in a terrace, or somebody digging a trench.
Would there have been specific tools to remove bone marrow from those animals? At that time, did they recognize the
To remove marrow from those bones, from the mammoths, they would have used hammerstones, and we didn't find any hammerstones, but the type of flakes that are in that waste pile could have been used as tools. There were some big flakes, those could have been used to cut the meat. So, or debitage that came off a tool that was used to cut the meat. But they would have been, if they were going after marrow, they would have used hammerstones. We didn't find any, but doesn't mean they're not there. Because we're looking at a sample. We haven't excavated the whole thing. Oh, and I should add, as we continue to excavate, we found a juvenile mammoth. So there's a mom, probably, and a child. So two animals, two mammoths, juvenile. And so that also begs the question, how'd they get killed in a place like that? Well, I guess you could argue that, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bear, but it's kind of odd out in the open like that. Those animals try to corner them in something confining. This is up on the high plane surface, on the edge, though. Yeah.
Like lightning?
Lightning? Yeah, it could have. I would say it's not impossible, remember? Don't use that word. Not likely, but not impossible. Yeah, that happens. Cattle get hit by lightning, right? So that could have killed them, possibly. So anyway, the last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm not done here. I've kept you guys long enough. Most of you are still awake. That's good. Anyway, this is going to be very brief. I just want to mention that this is a site that I've actually, again, this is returning to a site that had been previously recorded clearly outside the Great Plains. We're in the Canadian Yukon, this red dot right there. It's a pretty famous site called Bluefish Caves. They're not really caves, they're rock shelters. There's one of them right there. The other one's behind this rock. This past summer we flew out there. Logistically, this was a nightmare because the only way in here is by helicopters. You'll see in a second. There's Bluefish Cave 1 and Bluefish Cave 2. Again, they're really rock shelters. And these were excavated back in the early 70s by a French team. And they found lots of Pleistocene animals, a lot of horse. There was caribou. There was some mammoth. But horse dominated the assemblage. This would have been in the ice-free corridor in Beringia. And so Lorianne Bouchon, who's a zooarchaeologist, so she studies bones. In fact, she just arrived in Lawrence last week and is going to do a postdoctoral associateship with me. She studied the remains of these animals because they were Cinq-Mars, the archaeologists claimed that this was an archaeological site that dates to about 20 to 25,000 years ago, which would make it, if you throw out the San Diego one, the oldest site in the New World. And he found artifacts, but there were questions about the context of the artifacts with the bones. And Lorianne actually did her dissertation on the bones, going in with the idea she was going to prove that this was not an archaeological site. At the end of her dissertation, she went 180 degrees and said, this is an archaeological site, because what she saw on the bones were these striations. You see them? Those are classic cut marks, butcher marks. They're parallel. They're not, gnawing animals do not create cut marks like that. Something like a dire wolf chewing on this bone they'd be thick, they'd be at odd angles, they'd intersect. These are parallel cut marks. They're butcher marks, which actually makes this bone an artifact because it's been human modified. Okay, so it is an artifact. And the bone was directly dated to 19,650 years ago, okay? Not 25, but closer to 20. Now, Cinq-Mars, when he was doing this in the 70s, radiocarbon dating was a little more problematic. This was done at Oxford, purified collagen. That's a good date. So about 20,000 years ago, I think is pretty reliable. And here's another bone with very distinct butcher marks in it, dating to 18,500. That is an artifact, and most people buy it. There's still some, like Stuart Fidel, I don't want to mention any names, but I did already, who would argue that maybe there's something else that created those marks. What would that be? I do not know. But this makes it the oldest site in the New World, if we buy this. And so this past summer, as I said, we flew out there. The only way in is by helicopter from a little community of Old Crow. It's about a 30-minute flight in and out. So they brought us in every day, took us out by the end of the day because you don't want to hang out there because there are lots of bears. It's a beautiful view. So you're in the boreal forest, and you were remote. Yeah, you're a long way from anybody. And this is cave 3. They didn't excavate the entire cave. They left quite a bit intact. So we went out and we restudied it just briefly to see if there were still bones. So we're focusing on this area down here, and there were lots of bones. There's bones, cluster of them. Mostly, again, horse bone and horse mandible sticking out. So that's the jaw of a horse sticking out. And so we brought this collection back, and Lorianne Bouchon is studying them now, looking for cut marks. And there were artifacts, but we didn't find any, but previously when they excavated, there were a few artifacts in sort of association with the bones from what we heard. So what we're going to do, we also sampled sediments for DNA, looking for human DNA. In a cold environment, if there were people here with the animals handling the bones, they could have left DNA. So that, again, would be a direct link between the animals and the people. So what we're going to do this summer is we're going to come back to Bluefish Caves. There was one cave that was never excavated, although there were artifacts found right here, where this is Lorianne. This doesn't look much like a cave, because again, it's a rock shelter, and it's a pretty small opening, but this is what all the caves look like when they first excavated. This is actually good, because it means they have filled with sediment and protected what's ever in them. So I'm just really thrilled that this is preserved. And so we're gonna spend about 2 weeks this summer out there excavating the site. So anyway, I've said enough, and I'm going to end on this slide. So, by taking this geological approach, what I'm trying to convince you is that this kind of increases the size of the needle in the haystack by filtering, where to look, how to approach it, so that it's not such a big haystack. So anyway, On that note, I'm done. I appreciate you guys hanging in here with me for so long.
I'm sure that there's some time for some questions and that sort of thing.
So, yes.
Your students with their extreme date, what was their evidence to create that date?
So the actual date was determined by a technique called uranium series dating. And I'll tell you that bone is probably the worst material to use that procedure on, but it's the only thing they could use. There was no charcoal is beyond radiocarbon dating. OSL, they tried it, it didn't work, it doesn't always work. So they went to uranium series. It's bad on bone because bone is very porous and can be easily contaminated by water moving through it and contaminating it with uranium, basically. It's probably older than 130,000. But the reason they thought it was cultural was mainly because of the modification of the bones. There's a lot of features, like I showed you, at those, like Lovewell, at Lasena, and the fact that these big objects, that look like hammerstones, and what's the other one? For anvil stone, thank you. Anvil stones and hammerstones were right next to the bones. So, and again, they couldn't come up with a good scenario on how those got there, because they wouldn't have floated in. So, although there has been a paper published recently by an engineer who built the highway, who claims they could have been incorporated during construction of the highway. This is right on the shoulder of the highway. He thinks they could have moved, these big stones could have moved down through construction. So maybe that's how they got there. But it's about as controversial a site as you could ever get, because it's such a claim. Like I said, if you go 1,000, 2,000 years out from Clovis, it's controversial. So 130,000 years, yeah. Interesting. I'm hoping to actually see the site. They're going to try to reopen it, and when they do, I'm going to go out and look at it. So, yeah.
You've, of course, work on the central area. What about out on the west coast, at the La Brea tar pits and places like that? What kind of dates do they have?
Those actually go back into the Pleistocene as well, although they've never found any artifacts in association with those, within the tar pits, for example. People probably were smart enough not to get into the quagmire. Did they find one? What was that? Human remain?
Well, I think so. Well, we were there. And
Well, how old were the remains?
I would think 26,000, but I
Yeah,
can't remember.
yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
And to get down to the South America,
Mhm.
much longer would it take? So they've been around a long time, but what, 20,000 is that what we're sort of?
Well, we know that at the southern tip of Chile, people were down there by 12,500 years ago, and that's in radiocarbon years. So 14,500, which means to get there, they had to be up in North America much earlier. So a date of 20,000 doesn't seem unreasonable. And what's interesting is if you talk to some of my colleagues even who are ancient DNA specialists, they know about the rate of mutation with DNA. And there's a clock, basically a DNA clock, that pushes people, looking at modern Native Americans, that pushes people back somewhere between 20 and 25,000 years ago, based on the rate of mutation of DNA. And there's also linguists who study, and this is outside my area, but who talk about the evolution of language. They also claim 20,000 would be quite acceptable. But it's the DNA evidence, I think, that's really interesting, that suggests a human presence here at least 20,000 years ago, if not 25,000 years ago. So
But then in Europe and all that, they can go back.
you're talking hundreds of thousands of years, yes. Pushing back into the Paleolithic, you get into Africa, you're talking about the earliest hominids, so hundreds of thousands of years. So, and the idea of 130,000 here would have been actually pre-Paleolithic. You're talking, we're not even sure what they would be. Neanderthal-like. How would they have gotten here? They would have to do it by boat. There was water Beringia was underwater.
When it was frozen.
Well, Beringia would have been underwater. The bridge, land bridge,
Yeah,
at 130,000 years ago.
yeah.
So they had to do it by boat. So I'm trying to imagine a Neanderthal on a boat. You know? I won't say impossible, right? Possible. Unlikely, but possible. Yeah. Yes, all the way back.
What's the evidence for the theory that human hunting pressure helped with the extinction of mammoths?
Yeah, that's a real controversial topic. You know, it's called the overkill hypothesis, that when people arrived in the New World, i.e. here, the animals had evolved without people. Therefore, they were not afraid of people. They didn't view people as predators. They probably learned pretty quick, but that they were pretty easy prey, and that as people spread across the Americas, they basically wiped out mammoth, mastodon, American camel, American horse. I have issues, along with a lot of other people have issues with that hypothesis, in that there was a dramatic climate change at the end of the Pleistocene, where it became, remember I told you, it went from being very equitable to very seasonal. And that seasonality would have wiped out the vegetation would have changed dramatically and would have wiped out those animals. I would at least say that the hunters could have been the coup de grace. In other words, they basically polished off a compromised population that was already on its way out. I do not believe that people were the direct cause of the extinction of megafauna. They may have been part of the equation, but a small part. I think climate change is what killed them.
Well, the Ice Age, the last.
Yeah, the Ice Age ended 12,000 calendar years ago. And that's, by the way, and the animals were already starting to die off as that climate change was occurring. And by 12,000, they were pretty much gone. The only place where I would argue for overkill is on islands where animals were trapped. And I've worked on one of those islands and have argued that in Cyprus, there's a rock shelter I worked on where there were the remains of 600 pygmy hippos. These were little hippos, they were adult hippos the size of a pig. 600 plus the remains of in a rock shelter. And the animals died off soon after people arrived. Dealing with insular populations, island, it's a little different than continents because they're stuck there. They have no place to go. Humans were the only predators they were faced with. So there I'd say overkill works, but not on the continents. That's kind of a long answer to a short question, but yeah. Yes.
So here, if we're standing on a bluff overlooking the bottom,
Right.
where would an artifact be?
Probably, I'm going to assume there's probably Peoria loess under this building. So you could go probably just right below the surface, maybe half a meter, getting into something that's Clovis, a meter into pre-Clovis. So not very deep. So because we've pretty well dated the Peoria loess around here. And it stopped accumulating about 12,000 years ago. So you might find even later stuff, that's 10,000 years and younger, on the surface or slightly below, where it's been bioturbated down a little bit into the plow zone. But if you want to look for Clovis and pre-Clovis, go down half a meter, and that's where it should be. So places like this, around this rim, this is actually a place the Odyssey team should come back to and systematically do a survey around Cheyenne Bottoms, but it means we got to put holes in the ground. So if we get landowners to agree to us putting holes in the ground, it would be a good way to test our hypothesis. But this is a great place to look because with a basin with water, that would have been a magnet for game, which would have been a magnet for people. I'd be amazed if there aren't shallowly buried Paleoindian, Clovis, Folsom, and possibly pre-Clovis. This is the place to look. Good place to look. Yes?
Do you have instruments nowadays that could sense those kind of things without digging?
Yes and no. The yes part is, in fact, at the Charmin Mammoth site, I was talking about in Scott County, We brought out what's called a ground penetrating radar device, GPR, and ran it across the ground to try to pick up bones, because what we now know are two mammoths are scattered. So to focus our search, we used GPR to try to find the bones. It found some of them, but it doesn't work well in silt. And guess what loess is? It's about 80% silt. It likes sand, or even clay it does better, but silt it hates. So this is a terrible place to use GPR. You know, it's just the way it is. Sandhills in Nebraska would be great, or the sandhills along the Arc, some of those dune fields, great. But the loess mantle, forget it. It'll go about that deep, and then you're done. We tried it a couple places. It failed miserably, unfortunately. Yeah.
Did the dust from the dust storm of the 30s mess up anything archaeologically?
It buried it even more so. We've looked at some sites, particularly in western Kansas, that have dunes, loess dunes and sand dunes on top of them, that make it even harder to find the culture materials. Only along some of the streams or some cut banks, you'll see a big pile of sediment from the 30s, and then late Pleistocene sediments, and then archaeology. So there's a site down in southwestern Kansas, it's a bison kill that dates 9,000 years ago, that has these big dunes on the top with barbed wire sticking out of the dunes. So we know it's from the Dust Bowl days. So it just makes it a little bit messier, makes it harder to find. Again, it's that filtering of the record, in this case, burying it even deeper. So it doesn't help, it hurts the search. Although, I'll qualify it, in a few places in the 30s in the dune fields where there were blowouts, it is actually exposed at a couple sites. There's one not far from Garden City like that. It actually blew out a dune, and there was this buried soil with Folsom artifacts on it. So sometimes it helps, more often it doesn't. So anyway.
What about the mammoth bones that they found by the airport down Pratt?
Let's see, the Pratt, oh yes. There was no archaeology though associated with that. And I don't think they ever dated that. I know what you're talking about. You know, mammoth bones just show up all over the place. Usually it's a tusk here, a bone there. There was a site near Cunningham that Wichita State excavated. We got involved, but it was just all it was a huge tusk. You look closely, because again, where we see mammoth, I get in the car, I go. But unfortunately, nothing archaeological. You know, mammoths were all over Kansas, and they're constantly found in rivers, in road cuts, in quarries that are built all the time, sand pits, gravel pits. But it's finding them in place with artifacts is the problem. The challenge, I guess is the way to put it.
Now, there seems to be an awful lot of evidence along the headwaters of the Minnesota. Is that much work done?
We've not done a lot of work there. Yeah. Up around Pratt is where you're talking about, that area. Yeah. I've done a little bit. There's a lot of late Holocene, the last couple thousand years of sediment. And there's a lot of dunes in that area too, to the east.
Well, I know a specific rock outcropping, 10-12 feet, and we found a lot of other artifacts, Indian artifacts, up closer to the soil.
Mhm.
So it appears that it may have been a campsite.
Well, of course, yep.
Don't know if anyone's looked at it. No.
I don't know if anyone has examined that. I don't know. But you know, any of you who know of specific sites that have promise, especially if they're extinct animals, you know, some of these Pleistocene animals like mammoth or mastodon, let me know. I'll come out and look at them.
So this particular site is probably overall about 20 feet above the flood today.
Is it on the surface or buried?
Well, part of it's open.
But is it in the upper part or down deep?
Well, the rock, you know, it's up
Yeah,
above.
yeah.
And the Minnesota is just, in half a mile.
Hard to say. I mean, it could be something early. Hard to say. Okay.
All right. Well, let's
Yeah,
thank
well-
you.